Eleanor Whitmore pressed her back against the cold wall of the train compartment and read the letter one final time. The letter she had written to him, the one she almost didn't send, the one that began with the words that had defined her entire life. I am not a beautiful woman. Her hands weren't shaking because she was afraid of arriving. They were shaking because for the first time in 36 years, she had told the complete truth to a stranger, and he had written back anyway. If this story already has your heart beating a little faster, you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single story we bring you. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels, how many hearts it finds, how many women it reminds that they were never the problem. Now settle in, because what happens next in the Montana Territory in the winter of 1884 is going to stay with you for a long time. The train had been moving for 11 hours when Eleanor finally stopped pretending she wasn't terrified. She had spent most of the journey sitting very still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the window without really seeing anything outside it. The other passengers in the compartment had looked at her the way people always looked at her, that quick assessment, that flicker of something uncomfortable, that almost imperceptible decision to look away. She was used to it. She had been used to it since she was 9 years old, and a boy at school had announced to the entire classroom that Eleanor Whitmore took up too much space on the bench, and could she please move to the end. She had moved to the end. She had been moving to the end ever since. But this morning, somewhere between the flat golden stretches of Wyoming and the first hard rise of the Montana foothills, Eleanor had done something she hadn't done in years. She had taken out the letter, not the one William Carter had sent her, but the one she had sent him, and she read it again. Every word of it. The careful, plain, almost brutal honesty she had committed to paper in her small rented room in Wichita on a Tuesday night, when she had decided that if she was going to do this impossible thing, she was going to do it without pretending. Mr. Carter, she had written. Before you decide anything, you should know the truth. I am not a beautiful woman. I am overweight, and I have spent most of my life being reminded of that. I do not have a fine figure or a fashionable appearance, and I will not deceive you by pretending otherwise. But I can cook. I can work from sunup past sundown without complaint. I know how to manage a household, how to stretch supplies through a hard winter, how to keep a home running even when everything around it is falling apart. If those things matter to you, perhaps we have something worth discussing. If they do not, I understand completely, and I wish you well. She had almost thrown it away. She had written 4 other versions. First, softer versions that didn't lead with her appearance versions, that let him discover the truth on his own when she stepped off the train and watched his face change. But every time she read those softer versions, they felt like a lie. And Eleanor Whitmore had enough problems without adding dishonesty to the list. So she had sent the hard truth, and then she had spent 2 weeks expecting silence. What she got instead was a single page in a strong, unhurried hand. Miss Whitmore, I appreciate your letter more than you may realize. Honesty is not a common currency out here. The position remains open. The wagon will meet you at the station in Billings on the 14th. W. Carter. She had read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Now the conductor was calling out the Billings stop, and Eleanor was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand, pulling her coat tighter across her shoulders, lifting her old brown suitcase from the overhead rack. It wasn't heavy. She hadn't brought much because she hadn't been sure she'd be staying and making her way down the narrow aisle toward the door. The platform was raw and cold, in a way that Kansas cold never quite managed. Montana cold had a particular personality. It didn't just lower the temperature. It pressed. It found the gaps in your coat and your confidence and worked its way through both. Eleanor stepped down from the train and stood on the platform and looked around. There were maybe a dozen people waiting, families reuniting, a few men in heavy work coats watching the cargo car. And at the far end of the platform, leaning against a post with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low against the wind, a man who was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. He was taller than she had imagined, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who did real physical work, not the manufactured broadness of men who wanted to look impressive. His coat was good quality, but worn the kind of coat that had been well made once and had since become part of the person wearing it. His face, what she could see of it beneath the brim of his hat, was weathered and serious, with deep lines around his eyes that could have come from squinting into the sun or from years of holding things in. Probably both. He pushed off from the post and walked toward her. Eleanor stood her ground. She had promised herself she would stand her ground. His eyes moved over her once, not the way men usually looked at her. Not that quick inventory that ended in a barely concealed wince, but carefully the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand, rather than something he is trying to judge. He stopped a few feet away. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, and quieter. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Thank you for the wagon." He glanced past her at the platform, then back at her. "Is that your only bag?" "Yes, sir." He reached out and took the suitcase from her hand. Not roughly, not with any particular ceremony. Just took it the way you take something from someone who has been carrying it long enough. "You must be tired," he said. "It's a long ride from Kansas." "I'm all right," she said, which was partially true. He nodded once and turned toward the wagon without another word, and Eleanor followed him, and that was how it began. The ride to the Carter Ranch took the better part of 2 hours. The road climbed and wound through country that was, even in the hard grip of February, spectacularly itself vast and indifferent and brutally beautiful in the way that places are beautiful when they haven't been softened for anyone's comfort. William Carter drove the wagon with the easy competence of a man who had made this particular trip 1,000 times and had long since stopped noticing it. He didn't speak much. Eleanor didn't push him to. She sat beside him on the bench with her hands in her lap and looked at the land and thought about what it would mean to belong to a place like this and whether she was capable of it. "How many men work the ranch?" she asked, after they had been riding long enough that the silence had settled into something almost comfortable. 11 regular hands," he said. "More during calving season and roundup. And they eat together. In the cookhouse. Martha Bell runs the kitchen." He paused. "She's been here 20 years. Eleanor understood the information that was being conveyed underneath that statement. "There is already a woman in charge of that kitchen. Tread carefully." "I won't be stepping on anyone's territory," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "I didn't say you would." "No," she agreed, "but you were thinking it might come up." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like the shadow of one, the place where a smile might have lived once and hadn't entirely forgotten the address. "Martha runs a tight operation," he said. "Good," Eleanor said. "I can work inside a tight operation." He didn't say anything else, and neither did she, and the wagon kept moving north through the cold Montana afternoon, and Eleanor Whitmore kept breathing steady and slow, and told herself she had already survived every hard thing that had ever come at her, and she could survive this too. The ranch house was larger than she had pictured it. Most men described their properties in terms designed to impress, which usually meant the reality was disappointing. William Carter had not described his property at all, which turned out to mean the reality was substantial. The main house was 2 stories built from good timber, solid and square, with a covered porch that wrapped around the front and one side. Beyond it, she could see the outlines of the barn. The cookhouse, 2 smaller structures she couldn't immediately identify, and the long dark shapes of fencing stretching away in every direction. A man came out of this barn as they pulled up and took the horses without being asked, nodding at William and sliding a curious look at Eleanor that he didn't bother to hide. William helped her down from the wagon. His hand was very large and very calloused, and he released her the moment she was steady on the ground. "I'll show you the house," he said. "Then I'll introduce you to Martha." "All right," Eleanor said, and followed him up the porch steps and through the front door. The inside of the house hit her like a physical thing. It was not dirty. It was not poorly maintained. Every surface was clean, the floors were swept, the windows were clear. Someone had been taking care of the physical structure of this place with diligence and regularity. But it was empty in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. There was no smell of cooking, no boots left by the door in the careless, comfortable way of a home where someone feels at ease. The mantel above the fireplace held a clock, and nothing else. No photographs. No small objects that people accumulate when they are living rather than simply occupying space. The curtains were plain and hung with military precision that suggested they had never been opened or closed for anything except function. This was not a home. This was a very well-maintained shelter. Eleanor looked around the main room and felt something settle in her chest. Not sadness exactly. Something more purposeful than sadness. "It's a fine house," she said. "It serves," William said. She looked at him. He was watching her watch the room, and there was something careful in his expression, like a man waiting for a verdict he's already braced himself for. "I can do something with this," she said quietly. "If you'll let me." He was quiet for a moment. "That's why you're here," he said. But she heard something underneath it that she didn't examine too closely. Something that sounded less like permission and more like relief. Martha Bell found Eleanor in the kitchen the following morning before sunrise. Eleanor had woken early. She always woke early. It was one of the rhythms of her that nothing had ever managed to change, and had come downstairs to look at the kitchen properly in the way you can only look at a kitchen when no one is watching you do it. Running her hands along the shelves. Opening the pantry and cataloging what was there. Standing at the stove and getting the feel of it. She had not heard the door open. "Who told you you could be in here?" Martha Bell was 61 years old, short with iron gray hair, and the kind of face that had been making up its mind about people for 6 decades, and had gotten very good at it. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and looked at Eleanor the way a border guard looks at someone whose papers might not be in order. Eleanor turned around slowly. "Nobody told me," she said. "I came to see what you had." "I have everything I need," Martha said. "Had it for 20 years. "I can see that," Eleanor said. "The pantry is well organized. You've got good stock." Martha's eyes narrowed. She had clearly been prepared to have her territory defended against, not complimented. "Mr. Carter said you'd be helping with the house," Martha said. "Not the kitchen." "He said I'd be helping with the household," Eleanor said carefully. "I expect that includes the kitchen, since the kitchen is where most of a household happens. But I'm not interested in taking over what's yours. I just want to understand what's already working before I touch anything." There was a long pause. "You cooked before?" Martha asked. "Since I was 7 years old," Eleanor said. "My mother taught me, her mother taught her. I can do things in a kitchen that I can't do anywhere else in the world, and I know that, and I'm not modest about it. But I also know you've been feeding 11 men through Montana winters for 20 years, and that's not nothing. I'm not here to make you feel small." Martha looked at her for a long moment. "Coffee's in the tin on the left," she said finally. "Not the right. Left." "Thank you," Eleanor said. It was not friendship. It was not even warmth. But it was the unlocking of a door, and Eleanor had learned over the course of her life that an unlocked door was a place to begin. The first week was an education in what it meant to live inside someone else's grief without acknowledging it. William Carter moved through his house like a man navigating a place he had agreed to inhabit without ever quite committing to it. He was up before dawn, gone to the work of the ranch, back after dark, ate his supper in the kitchen, with the quiet efficiency of a man refueling rather than enjoying a meal, and retired early. He was not unkind. He was not cold in any aggressive way. He simply seemed to have made a series of decisions about which parts of himself he was going to make available to the world, and warmth was not among them. Eleanor had been told by the woman at the agency, a brisk, practical woman in Kansas City, who matched people the way a good mechanic matches parts, that William Carter had been widowed 7 years ago. That his wife Clara had died of fever in the summer of 1877. That he had run the ranch alone since then, and that what he was looking for, the agency woman had said with the particular careful phrasing of someone describing something complicated, was A capable woman to manage the household and provide companionship. Companionship. Eleanor had turned that word over in her mind for weeks before she came here. She knew what it meant and what it didn't mean, and where the line was between them, and she had made her peace with the possibility that this was a practical arrangement between two practical people, and that was all it would be. She was 36 years old. She had no illusions left about being swept off her feet. What she had not expected was to watch a man suffer so quietly that you could be in the same room with him for a week and almost miss it. It was the small things. The way he sometimes stopped in the middle of a room and stood very still for a moment, like a man who had gone somewhere else entirely, and then had to find his way back. The way he sat at the kitchen table in the evenings after supper. Not reading, not doing anything, just sitting with an expression that had no particular name, but that Eleanor recognized in the way you recognize something you've seen from a distance in someone else's eyes before. The way he never, not once in that entire first week, sat in the armchair by the fire in the parlor, though it was clearly the most comfortable seat in the house. She asked Martha about it on the 6th day. Clara's chair was all Martha said without looking up from the pot she was tending. Eleanor didn't ask anything else. She began with bread. This was her instinct built over decades of feeding people who needed feeding not just in their stomachs, but in the parts of themselves that hunger in ways that have nothing to do with food. You begin with bread because bread is ancient and honest, and because the smell of it does something to the inside of a house that nothing else can replicate. It reaches into rooms where you aren't standing. It comes down hallways. It goes through closed doors. It announces itself without apology and asks nothing in return. She baked 4 loaves on the 7th morning. The cookhouse already had its own breakfast going. Martha's oatmeal and salt pork, the reliable infrastructure of a working ranch. But Eleanor made bread in the main house kitchen, and the smell moved through the rooms and down the stairs and out under the front door and across the porch. She was slicing the 2nd loaf when William came back from the morning chores. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked at him over her shoulder. "Sit down," she said. "I'll cut you a piece." He sat down. She set a thick slice in front of him with the butter she'd been working on since sunrise. Real butter, not the thin stuff, and a small pot of the blackberry preserves she'd found in the back of the pantry, behind 3 years' worth of more practical supplies clearly put there and forgotten, or perhaps put there and not touched, because someone had made them and that someone was gone. She watched him pick up the bread. She watched him take a bite. She watched something move across his face that she wasn't entirely sure he knew was there. "This is good," he said. His voice was different from the voice he used for everything else. Quieter, less guarded. "Thank you," she said. He ate the whole slice, and then he sat there for a moment with his hands around his coffee cup, and Eleanor stood at the counter, and neither of them said anything, and it was the first silence between them that felt like something other than an absence. By the end of the 2nd week, the ranch hands had started finding reasons to be near the main house at mealtimes. This was not by accident, and it was not by design, or rather, it was by Eleanor's design without anyone understanding that she was designing anything. She had simply begun making more. More bread. More pie. A stew that simmered all afternoon and filled the whole property with the smell of something worth coming in from the cold for. She left things on the kitchen windowsill the way she had learned from her mother, because a kitchen windowsill was a kind of silent invitation that people could accept without having to ask for anything. A young hand named Thomas, who couldn't have been more than 19 and was clearly not eating enough, started appearing at the back door on the 2nd Tuesday. "Miss Whitmore," he said with his hat in his hands. Martha said you had extra." "Sit down, Thomas," Eleanor said. He sat down, and she put a bowl of stew in front of him, and cut him bread, and he ate with the concentrated gratitude of a very hungry young man, and when he was done he said, "Thank you, ma'am," with such sincerity that Eleanor had to turn back to the counter so he wouldn't see what his sincerity did to her face. After that there were 2 men on Wednesday, 3 on Friday. By the following week, the back porch had become an informal gathering point in the late afternoons, and Eleanor had started baking in larger quantities without mentioning it to anyone. Martha noticed. "You're feeding the whole county," Martha said one morning, not without approval. I'm feeding the people in front of me, Eleanor said. Martha looked at her. Then she made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but occupied a similar territory. I used to do that, she said. Clara used to say I was running a charity operation. It was the first time Martha had said Clara's name to her directly. Eleanor received it with the care it deserved. She sounds like she was a woman who paid attention, Eleanor said. She was, Martha said. And then after a moment, you remind me of her, not in looks, but in how you see things. Eleanor didn't say anything. She kept her hands busy with the dough she was working, and let Martha's words settle into the kitchen air alongside the smell of bread and the low sound of the wind outside. It was the end of the third week when she heard the other women talking. She had gone into town with William to collect supplies, a practical errand. He had explained nothing more, but he'd said it in a way that suggested he was explaining it to himself as much as to her. The general store in the settlement was run by a man named Harold Price, who had clearly been expecting them, or at least expecting her, because there was a quality of alertness in the store when they walked in that had nothing to do with their arrival, and everything to do with the fact that they had already been discussed. The two women were by the dry goods. They were maybe Eleanor's age, though they carried their age differently, fashionably dressed by the standards of a Montana settlement in 1884, which meant their dresses were newer and their hair was more deliberately arranged. They were talking to each other in the bright, carrying voices of women who want to be overheard without appearing to want that. I heard he sent all the way to Kansas, one of them said. Kansas, the others said, as if the word itself explained something unfortunate. Well, the first one let her eyes slide sideways, not at Eleanor directly, but in the direction of Eleanor, in the way of someone who wants you to know they see you without wanting to give you the dignity of their direct attention. I suppose when a man has been alone long enough, he adjusts his expectations. Eleanor heard it. Of course she heard it. The store was not large. William heard it too. She knew because she felt him go still beside her, that particular quality of stillness that is not stillness at all, but contained motion, the way a river goes quiet just before it changes direction. Mrs. Henderson, he said. His voice was perfectly level. Mrs. Forsythe. Both women turned. Their expressions rearranged themselves into the shapes of pleasantness. Mr. Carter, said the one he'd called Mrs. Henderson. We didn't see you come in. I believe you did, William said. This is Miss Whitmore. She's come from Kansas to manage my household. Yes, Mrs. Henderson said, and the way she said it contained a full paragraph that she was choosing for the moment not to speak aloud. Eleanor looked at her directly. This was a thing she had learned over the years, not to look away first, not to give people the satisfaction of watching her shrink. It cost her something every single time. It cost her something now. But she held the woman's gaze and kept her expression neutral and did not apologize with her eyes for existing in a space that someone else had decided was not hers. Ladies, William said, and that was all he said, but it closed the conversation the way you close a door, not slamming it, just firmly with finality, so everyone understands there is no more room to pass through. He put his hand briefly at Eleanor's elbow, not grabbing, not steering. Just present a small gesture of acknowledgement, and they moved toward the counter where Harold Price was waiting with the supply list. Eleanor kept her breathing even. She kept her face composed. She did not let either of those women see what their words had done to the thing inside her chest that had been slowly, carefully, tentatively beginning to believe that she had a right to be here. But she felt it. She felt all of it. On the ride home, William didn't say anything about what had happened in the store. Neither did she. The road was cold, and the horses moved steadily, and the sky was the particular pale winter blue of a Montana afternoon. After a while, William said, Mrs. Henderson's husband lost 3 sections of grazing land to bad debt last year. She's been angry at the world since. Eleanor looked at him. Mrs. Forsythe, he continued with the same level tone, married a man she didn't particularly want because she ran out of better options. She's been regretting it since before the wedding. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me that? Because angry people look for things to diminish, he said. Makes them feel less small. He paused. "It doesn't have anything to do with you." Eleanor looked at the road. "It feels like it does," she said honestly. "I know," he said, "but it doesn't." It was the longest string of sentences she had heard him put together about anything that wasn't the ranch, and she held them in her mind for the rest of the ride, the way you hold something that might be fragile. That night, she made a beef pie with a crust that had taken her most of the afternoon. She made it the way her grandmother had made it, with butter worked in cold and the edges crimped by hand, and she brought it to the table when William came in from the evening work, and she sat across from him while he ate it. Not something she usually did, not something he'd asked for, just something she decided to do. He ate 2 full portions. "My grandmother's recipe," she said when he looked up. "She was a good cook," he said. "She was a great cook," Eleanor said. "She told me once that cooking for someone is the most honest thing you can do for them, because you can't fake a good meal. Either it's there or it isn't." William was quiet for a moment. He turned his fork over in his hand. "Clara used to say." He started and then stopped. Eleanor waited. He didn't finish it. He set the fork down and looked at the table, and then he pushed his chair back and said, "Thank you for supper," and left the room with the careful walk of a man who has let something get too close to the surface and needs to put distance between himself and it. Eleanor sat at the table alone and looked at the half-empty pie dish and the 2 plates and the 2 cups and the ordinary human evidence of 2 people who had sat down together. And she thought about what it cost a person to carry 7 years of grief in a house where every room remembered something. She thought about what it might mean to help someone put their grief down without taking it from them. She was still thinking about it when she heard his boots on the stairs, and then the quiet of the house settled back in, and outside the Montana wind moved across the land, the way it had always moved, indifferent to all of it, and Eleanor Whitmore cleared the table and washed the plates and stood at the kitchen window for a long time before she finally went to bed. By the end of the month, something had shifted in the Carter Ranch in a way that was difficult to name precisely, but impossible to miss. The men laughed more. Not at anything in particular, just that easy background laughter of people who are comfortable where they are. Thomas had taken to lingering after meals to help carry things, a development that Martha regarded with a suspicious eye, until she caught him actually washing dishes one afternoon, at which point she revised her opinion of him upward by several degrees. The back porch had become a genuine gathering spot, especially in the late afternoons when the worst of the cold had passed, and Eleanor had started keeping a pot of coffee there and sometimes cornbread, because cornbread was better eaten warm and in company. William had begun sitting at the kitchen table longer after supper. Not much longer. 20 minutes instead of 5. Sometimes he talked. Sometimes he didn't. But he stayed. And Eleanor was beginning to understand that for a man who had spent 7 years making himself smaller in order to keep moving forward, staying was not a small thing at all. One evening he told her about the cattle operation, not because she'd asked, though she had eventually, but because he had started talking and hadn't been able to stop. He told her about the winter of 1881, when they'd lost 40, head to a blizzard that came in without warning, and the drifts had been so deep you couldn't tell where the fencing was. He told her about the horse he'd had for 12 years that had pulled a tendon the previous spring, and had to be put down, and how he'd been the one to do it because some things you don't hand off to someone else. He told her about a homesteader family 3 miles north who'd had a hard year, and how the men had ridden over twice with extra feed without making a production of it, because that was how things worked out here, or how they were supposed to work. Eleanor listened. She didn't fill the silences with noise. She had learned early in her life that listening was a skill most people thought they had, and very few people actually possessed. And she had worked at it the way she worked at everything, with attention and patience, and the willingness to sit with discomfort, until it resolved into something she could understand. What she was beginning to understand about William Carter was this: he had not stopped feeling. He had stopped allowing himself to feel in the presence of other people. He had made a decision somewhere in the wreckage of that summer in 1877 that grief was a private territory, and he would manage it alone. And he had been managing it alone ever since, and it had cost him something that she wasn't sure he knew the name of. She thought about telling him that. She decided it was too early. Instead, she poured him more coffee and asked him about the cattle operation and let him keep talking for as long as he was willing to, because sometimes the most useful thing you can do for a person is simply give them a place where their words are welcome. On the last evening of her first month at the Carter Ranch, Eleanor stood at the kitchen window, after William had gone upstairs, and looked out at the dark Montana land, and thought about what her life had been before this, and what it might be after, and what it was right now, in this specific moment, in this specific house, which was still not quite a home, but was undeniably becoming something. She thought about the letter she had written. "I am not a beautiful woman." She thought about what she had meant by that, and what she had feared by it, and what she was slowly, carefully, tentatively beginning to suspect about whether it was the right thing to have said, or whether beauty was a category she had been allowing other people to define for her for so long that she had forgotten she might have her own definition. She didn't resolve anything that night. She wasn't in the business of easy resolutions. She just stood at the window for a while with the smell of bread still in the air and the sound of the ranch settling into its night rhythms outside, and thought that whatever this was, this arrangement, this house, this man who sat longer at the kitchen table than he used to, it was more than she had allowed herself to hope for when she stepped off that train into the Montana cold, and that might be enough. For now, that might be exactly enough. The morning Eleanor discovered what was really happening at the Carter Ranch did not begin with anything dramatic. It began with a biscuit. She had been awake since 4 in the morning. Her body had long since stopped recognizing any other rising time, and she was working through the second batch of biscuits for the ranch hand's breakfast when Martha came through the back door with her coat still on and her face wearing an expression Eleanor had not seen on her before. Martha Bell had exactly 3 expressions in regular rotation: skeptical, mildly approving, and focused. What she was wearing now was none of those things. "You need to stay inside today," Martha said. Eleanor set down the biscuit she was cutting. "Why? Just do it." "Martha?" The older woman pulled off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door with deliberate movements, the kind a person makes when they are deciding how much to say. "Harlan Decker's man came through town yesterday afternoon," she said finally. "Word is, Decker's had enough of waiting." Eleanor had heard the name Decker twice in her first month at the ranch. Both times it had been spoken in the particular flat tone that men in the West reserved for things that could get someone killed. She had not pushed for details because she had understood instinctively that some information was offered when people were ready to offer it, and not a moment before. "Waiting for what?" she asked. Martha looked at her. "For Mr. Carter to run out of reasons to say no." Before Eleanor could ask what he was supposed to be saying, Nota Thomas appeared at the back door, breathing hard, like he'd been running. He was 19, and he still had the look of a boy who'd been sent out to do a man's work, and was figuring out on the go whether he was equal to it. But this morning, his face was something else entirely. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "Mr. Carter's asking for you." She found William in the front room, standing at the window. He wasn't looking out at anything in particular. He was just standing there with his arms crossed over his chest and his jaw set in a way she hadn't seen before. On the table behind him was a piece of paper that someone had left there, not placed with care, but dropped the way you drop something you want someone to see without handing it to them directly. "What is this?" she asked. "A notice," he said without turning around, "from Decker's lawyer." She picked it up. The language was dense and official and deliberately difficult to parse, but the meaning underneath it was simple enough. Harlan Decker was asserting a claim to 2 sections of Carter land along the northern boundary on the basis of a deed dispute that the notice claimed had been unresolved since 1879. The notice informed William Carter that he had 30 days to respond, or the claim would be filed with the territorial court. Eleanor read it twice. "Is the claim legitimate?" she asked. William turned from the window then, and she saw his face properly for the first time that morning. He looked like a man who had been awake all night dealing with something he couldn't fight with his hands, and hadn't yet figured out how to fight with anything else. "No," he said. "It is not legitimate. That land has been Carter land since my father broke ground on it in 1861. I have the original deed. I have every record." Then, "Decker knows that," William said. "The point isn't to win the claim. The point is to tie me up in court proceedings long enough that the notes on the North Pasture improvements come due before I can address them. He's been trying to push me out of that section for 3 years. He wants the water access." Eleanor put the paper back on the table. She felt something moving through her that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger, but had elements of both a kind of sharp focusing clarity that she had learned over the years to pay attention to, because it meant her mind was working on something at high speed underneath everything else. "What does your lawyer say?" she asked. "I don't have one," William said. "Not in Billings. The closest man I trust is in Helena, and it's a 4-day ride in this weather." "Then write him today," Eleanor said. "Right now. Today." Something shifted in William's expression. "There's more," he said. She waited. "Decker came to the house yesterday morning," William said. "Before you were up. Before I sent Thomas to find you." He paused. "He made an offer. For the land." "For the ranch," William said. "All of it." The silence in the room was the kind that has weight. "He offered you money for everything," Eleanor said. "He offered me enough to leave," William said. That's how he framed it. Enough to go somewhere easier. He said. William stopped, and she could see the effort it cost him to repeat it. He said a man raising a ranch alone without family, without a real establishment, those were his words, was fighting a losing battle, and he'd be doing me a kindness to take it off my hands before the courts got involved. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about what it meant to stand in your own house and be told you didn't have a real establishment. She thought about what it meant to have someone offer you money to disappear. She thought about the letter she had written. I am not a beautiful woman, and the way she had learned to make herself small enough to pass through rooms without disturbing anyone. And she thought about how she had come here to stop doing that, and how William Carter, for all his hard exterior and his 7 years of managed grief, was doing the same thing in his own way without knowing it. "What did you tell him?" she asked. William looked at her with the first direct, uncomplicated expression she had seen from him since she arrived. "I told him to get off my land," he said. Something in Eleanor's chest did a thing she wasn't expecting. She looked at her hands for a moment to get her face in order. "Good," she said. "Then we write to Helena today, we." She didn't realize she'd said it until she heard the word in the room. And William heard it too, because something shifted in the set of his shoulders, something that had been drawn up tight, loosening slightly, the way a man breathes differently when someone else is standing with him, instead of watching from a distance. "I'll need paper," he said. "I'll get it," she said. The letter to the lawyer in Helena went out that afternoon. But the problem was not solved. Problems like Harlan Decker were never solved by a single letter. They were managed. They were navigated. They were weathered. The way you weather a hard winter by keeping your head down and your hands busy and your resolve intact. Eleanor understood this the way she understood most things from the inside, from the experience of having weathered things herself. What she had not anticipated was how fast Decker moved. Within a week of the notice, 2 of the ranch hands quit. They came to William separately on different days, with different variations of the same explanation. They'd had other offers they were moving on. No hard feelings, but the timing was too clean and the manner too rehearsed, and everyone on the property understood what had actually happened. Decker had money enough to make people's principles flexible, and he was using it. Thomas came to Eleanor the evening after the second man left while she was in the kitchen working through the bread for the following morning. He sat down at the table without being invited, which was a thing he'd stopped needing an invitation to do, and he looked at the surface of the table for a while before he spoke. "They offered me money to go too," he said. Eleanor kept working the dough. "How much?" "More than I make here in 3 months." He paused. "A lot more." "Did you take it?" "No," he said. "But I wanted you to know they asked." Eleanor looked up at him then. He was watching her with the particular expression of a very young man who has made a decision that cost him something and needs someone to tell him the decision was right, even though he already knows it is. "You're a good man, Thomas," she said. "Mr. Carter is lucky to have you." Thomas nodded. He looked at the table again. Then he said, "Miss Whitmore, are you scared?" Eleanor thought about it. The honest answer was yes, in ways she hadn't entirely sorted through yet. She was scared of what Decker would do next. She was scared of what losing this place would cost William, not just financially, but in the part of him that was just barely beginning to open back up after 7 years sealed shut. She was scared of the 2 women in the general store, and every version of them in this territory, the ones who had already decided she had no business being here and would use any available weapon to confirm that judgment. She was scared of a dozen things. "Yes," she said, "but being scared doesn't mean you stop." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "My daddy used to say that," he said. "Pretty much exactly that." "Your daddy was right," Eleanor said. She went back to the bread, and Thomas sat at the table for a while longer, in the comfortable way he'd developed over the past weeks, and outside the Montana wind pushed at the house and the night settled in cold and permanent, and Eleanor thought about what she was going to do and how she was going to do it, because she had already decided she was going to do something. She just hadn't figured out what yet. The something arrived as an idea at 3 in the morning on a Thursday, when Eleanor was lying in her room, listening to the wind, and turning the problem over in her mind, the way she turned dough repeatedly patiently, looking for the places where it gave. What Decker wanted was for William Carter to look isolated. A man alone, without family, without establishment. Those were the words he'd used. What Decker was counting on was that the narrative he was building, the one where William was a man on his own, fighting a losing battle, would hold up long enough for the legal maneuver to work. What if it didn't hold? What if the narrative was different? She was in the kitchen before 4 o'clock. Not for bread this time, but for paper. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up, and she wrote 4 letters. One to the pastor of the church in the settlement, whose wife she had spoken to twice, and who had expressed something that seemed like genuine warmth. One to the Brennan family, who ran a smaller ranch 6 miles east, and had stopped by once in her first week to bring something for William, and had stayed for an hour of what turned out to be real conversation. One to a woman named Agnes Culbertson, who was the wife of the settlement's doctor, and who had, at the general store 2 weeks ago, made a point of introducing herself to Eleanor in a way that was deliberately visible to Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Forsythe, and one to Harold Price at the general store, who had been quietly decent every time she had come in for supplies, and who she suspected knew everything that happened in this territory 3 days before anyone else did. She wrote them carefully, not asking for anything dramatic, just inviting them to the ranch the following Sunday for the meal that she was already planning. And she described the meal because she had learned over the course of her life that people respond to specificity, that a vague invitation is easy to decline, but a specific one reaches something more fundamental. She signed each letter with her full name and set them out to dry, and went back to bed. She did not tell William what she'd done until Sunday morning, by which time the kitchen was already hours into the project, and the entire property smelled like something that had no business being resisted. He came downstairs to find her at the stove, and Martha at the counter, and Thomas moving between the kitchen and the back room, carrying things with the focused expression of someone who had been given a task and understood its importance. "What's happening?" William said. "People are coming for Sunday dinner," Eleanor said without turning from the stove. A pause. "What people?" "The Brennans. Pastor Whitfield and his wife. Dr. Culbertson and Agnes. Harold Price." Another pause. Longer. "You invited them," he said. "Yes." She turned then because she wanted to see his face when she said the next part. "Mr. Carter Decker wants the county to think you're isolated. A man alone. No support. Nothing worth backing." She held his gaze. "I thought we ought to show them something different." William looked at her for a long moment. She could not entirely read his expression. There were things moving in it that were too deep and too complicated to sort at a glance. "You did this without telling me," he said. "Yes," she said honestly, "because I thought if I told you first, you'd tell me not to." His jaw tightened. She held her ground. "I could have handled this myself," he said. "I know you could have," she said. But you didn't have to." The silence between them had temperature. She felt it on her skin. Then he said, "How many people are coming?" 14 if everyone brings their families," Eleanor said. "Possibly 17. He looked at the kitchen. He looked at the activity happening in it. He looked at her. "I'll need to bring in extra chairs from the barn," he said. "Thomas knows where they are," she said. And he turned and went to find Thomas, and Eleanor turned back to the stove, and Martha, who had been very carefully not looking at either of them during the entire exchange, made a small sound that was definitely, Eleanor was certain of this, a suppressed laugh. The Sunday dinner was by any objective measure an extraordinary success. 14 people came. The Brennans brought their 3 youngest children. Agnes Culbertson arrived with a jar of her own preserved peaches and the kind of warm, efficient social energy that knits a room together in under an hour. Pastor Whitfield's wife turned out to be a woman named Ruth, who had been born in Georgia and had strong opinions about cornbread, most of which Eleanor shared, and within 20 minutes they were deep in a conversation about the ratio of cornmeal to flour that managed to be genuinely absorbing, despite being about cornmeal. Harold Price arrived last, a little late, slightly pink in the face from the cold, and sat down next to Jim Brennan, and within 10 minutes they were talking about the Decker land situation with a plainness that made clear this was not the first time the topic had come up among the people of this settlement. "He's been buying influence for 3 years, Harold said, not particularly quietly. "Everybody knows it. Trouble is, buying influence works if nobody pushes back. Then people need to push back," Jim Brennan said. "Somebody needs to show them it's worth doing," Harold said. William was sitting at the head of the table. Eleanor was in the kitchen, but the door was open and she heard all of it. She heard William say quietly, "I intend to make it worth doing." She heard the quality of the room change when he said it, that shift in the atmosphere that happens when people hear something and decide they believe it. She came out of the kitchen with the pie, 2 of them, 1 apple and 1 blackberry, the latter made from the jar of preserves that Martha had never opened because they had been Clara's, and she hadn't known what to do with them until Eleanor had very gently, on a Thursday morning, suggested that preserves were made to be used, and that using them was a form of honoring the person who made them. And Martha had handed the jar over without another word, and she set them on the table and sat down. And Agnes Culbertson said, "Eleanor, this meal was the finest I've had since coming to Montana, and I want you to know I don't say that lightly." And everyone at the table agreed in the overlapping, sincere, slightly loud way that people agree with things when they genuinely mean them. Eleanor looked at the table. She looked at the 14 people in the house that had been empty for 7 years. She looked at William, who was watching her from across the table with an expression she was learning the name of. She had to look down at her plate before she said something she wasn't ready to say. After the guests left, William found her in the kitchen. Martha had gone home. The older woman had her own small house on the property. One of the things Eleanor had learned in her first week, and Thomas had disappeared in the direction of the bunkhouse, and the main house was quiet, in the way it was always quiet in the evenings, but different tonight. The kind of quiet that comes after fullness, rather than the kind that comes after absence. William leaned in the kitchen doorway and watched her work for a moment. "Jim Brennan offered to speak to 2 of the county commissioners," he said, "on my behalf." "I heard," Eleanor said. "Harold Price is going to write something for the settlement paper about the deed dispute, what Decker's actually doing." He paused. "People are paying attention." "People are always paying attention," Eleanor said. "They just needed a reason to say so out loud." A beat of silence. "How did you know?" he asked. She thought about it. "I've spent my whole life being in rooms where people had decided things about me before I walked in," she said carefully, honestly. "The only thing that ever changed anyone's mind was showing them something real, something they couldn't dismiss." She kept her hands moving, folding the cloth she'd been using to dry the dishes. "You're something real, Mr. Carter. This ranch is something real. I just thought it needed to be seen." William was quiet for a long time. She could feel him thinking the way you can feel weather changing before you can see it. "William," he said. She looked up. "My name is William," he said. Not Mr. Carter. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about what it had taken for him to say that. What it costs a man who has kept everything at arm's length for 7 years to close the distance by even 1 degree. "All right," she said. "William." He nodded once. He pushed off from the doorway. He was almost out of the room when he stopped without turning around and said, "What you did today, the dinner, it was the right thing. I wouldn't have thought of it." She didn't say anything to that. She let it be what it was. She heard his boots on the stairs, and then the house was quiet, and she stood in the kitchen for a while longer, holding the folded cloth, thinking about the weight of a single name spoken out loud, and how much a person could mean by a thing that small. The following week, the second thing happened that she hadn't anticipated. She had gone into town alone. William had offered to take her. She had told him she could manage. Which was true, and also was something she needed to prove to herself. And she was at the dry goods counter when she became aware that the atmosphere of the store had shifted in the particular way it shifts when something is about to occur. Victoria Hale walked in with her chin up and her skirts brushing the floor with purpose. Eleanor had heard this name. Martha had told her not gossip. Martha didn't traffic in gossip. She trafficked in operational information that Victoria Hale was 24 years old, the daughter of Douglas Hale, whose business interests had made him the second wealthiest man in the settlement after William Carter, and that she had, in the years since William's wife died, made it widely understood that she considered herself the logical next chapter in William Carter's life. Eleanor had nodded at this information and stored it. Now Victoria stood 3 feet away and looked at her with the open, unashamed directness of a woman who has decided that social niceties are for situations involving social equals. "Miss Whitmore," she said. The way she said it made the title of address do the work of an insult. "Miss Hale," Eleanor said. "I've been meaning to speak with you," Victoria said. "I think it's best done directly." "I tend to agree," Eleanor said. Something flickered in Victoria's face. She had expected deference, and what she was getting was not deference, and it was briefly disorienting. She recovered quickly. "Mr. Carter is a kind man," she said. "He's the kind of man who feels responsible for people. I'm sure he's been very kind to you." "He has," Eleanor agreed. "I don't want you to mistake his kindness for something else," Victoria said, and the pleasantness in her voice was the kind that has been applied as a surface treatment over something much harder underneath. "He has obligations in this community, relationships, expectations that have been in place for a long time." Eleanor looked at her. She thought about all the things she could say. She thought about the 7 years this man had been alone in that house. She thought about Clara's chair that nobody sat in, and the preserves on the pantry shelf, and the expression on William's face when he said, "My name is William," and looked at her like she was something real. "Miss Hale," she said, and her voice was very quiet and very even. "I'm just a woman who cooks." Victoria looked at her for a moment, searching for the submission in that statement for the acknowledgement of lesser standing she expected to find there. She didn't find it because Eleanor hadn't put it there. "See that you remember that," Victoria said, and swept out of the store. Eleanor turned back to the counter. Harold Price was looking at a point somewhere above her head with the concentrated neutrality of a man pretending very hard that he had not heard anything. "2 pounds of the flour," Eleanor said. "And whatever you have that's fresh." "Yes, ma'am," Harold said and got to work. She rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon and thought about what had just happened. She thought about the thing Victoria Hale hadn't understood, or maybe did understand, and was afraid of that a woman who knows what she is, and what she does, and what she is worth, doesn't need to be reminded of it by anyone. That just a woman who cooks could mean exactly what Victoria wanted it to mean, or it could mean something else entirely, depending entirely on who was saying it and what they were carrying when they said it. She unhitched the horse herself, which she had been learning to do with increasing competence over the past weeks, and walked into the house through the back door, and Thomas looked up from the table where he was mending harness and said, "Good trip." "Informative," Eleanor said. Thomas looked at her face. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true, "I'm going to make something good for supper." Thomas grinned. He had an excellent grin for a 19-year-old. "You always do, Miss Whitmore." She went to the stove and she started cooking, and the smell of it moved through the house the way it always did, outward filling things, reaching places that had been empty, and she let it go where it went, and she didn't apologize for any of it, not for one single breath of it. And outside, the Montana winter was doing what it always did, which was exactly what it wanted. And inside the Carter Ranch kitchen, Eleanor Whitmore was doing the same. William came home late that evening. She heard the door, then his boots, then quiet. She had left his supper covered on the stove the way she had taken to doing when he came in after she'd gone to bed. But tonight she wasn't in bed yet. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the household ledger she'd been working through because the numbers had told her something she wasn't sure William had noticed yet about where the operating expenses were going, and she wanted to be sure she understood it before she said anything. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her. "You're up late," he said. "Sit down," she said. "There's stew on the stove." He got his supper and sat down across from her, and she kept her eyes on the ledger while he ate, giving him the silence she'd come to understand he needed before he was ready to talk. He ate half his stew. Then he said, "I heard you had words with Victoria Hale in town today." She looked up. "Harold Price," she said. "Harold Price," he confirmed. "What did she say?" "Nothing I hadn't already thought of myself," Eleanor said honestly. He looked at her. "Eleanor." She set down her pencil. "She told me not to mistake your kindness for something it isn't," she said. "She implied you had obligations in this community that predated my arrival." William was quiet. She could see him working through it, the anger he was deciding whether to spend and on what. "Victoria Hale's opinions about my obligations are her own business," he said finally. "Not mine, and not yours." "I know that," Eleanor said. "She doesn't speak for me," he said. "She doesn't speak for anything that happens in this house." "I know," Eleanor said again. And then, because she had promised herself when she wrote that first letter that she would not stop telling the truth. "But she said something true. I don't want to be here under false impressions. I don't want to mistake. Eleanor." His voice was low and it stopped her. She looked at him. His eyes were very direct and very serious, and there was something in them she had been catching glimpses of for weeks without being able to name it. "I hired a housekeeper," he said. "That's what I told the agency. That's what I told myself." He paused. "But I knew when I read your letter. I knew when I came to the station. I knew—" He stopped. He looked at the table. He picked up his fork and set it down again. "I don't know what this is," he said. "But I know what it isn't. It isn't nothing." The kitchen was very quiet. Eleanor looked at the man across from her, this man who hadn't sat in his own armchair in 7 years, who drove a wagon in February cold and picked up a stranger's suitcase without being asked, who said thank you for supper like it was the most important thing he'd said all day, because maybe it was. "All right," she said softly. He nodded. He picked up his fork. He ate the rest of his stew. She went back to the ledger, but neither of them moved to leave the table for another hour. The letter from the lawyer in Helena arrived on a Tuesday, and it was not the letter William had been hoping for. Eleanor knew it wasn't good news before he said a word. She had learned to read him the way you learn to read weather, not from any single sign, but from the accumulation of small things, the way he held his shoulders, the way he set something down on a table, the particular quality of silence he produced when he was working through something difficult. He came into the kitchen that afternoon with the letter already open and read and folded back into its envelope, and he set it on the table beside her breadboard, and stood there with his hands in his coat pockets, and said nothing for a moment. "Tell me," she said. "Morrison says the claim has more teeth than it should," William said. Decker's lawyer found a surveying error from 1871. The original boundary markers on the north section were placed incorrectly. "Morrison says it doesn't invalidate my deed, but it creates enough ambiguity that a territorial judge could rule either way." He paused. "And Morrison says the judge assigned to the district for the next 6 months is a man named Aldrich." Eleanor looked at him. "I take it that's significant." "Harlan Decker's brother-in-law is Edgar Aldrich's business partner," William said flatly. Has been for 4 years. The silence in the kitchen was the kind that meant something. Can Morrison challenge the assignment? Eleanor asked. He can try, but trying takes time, and time is what Decker is buying. William pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and the way he sat, not with the careful, controlled posture she'd grown used to, but with a heaviness that was different, told her more than anything he'd said. Morrison says if the notes on the North Pasture improvements come due before this is resolved, I'll have to liquidate. Not everything, but enough that the operation changes substantially. How long before the notes come due? 90 days. Eleanor put down the knife she'd been using to cut carrots. She wiped her hands on her apron. She sat down. Then we have 90 days, she said. Morrison thinks. I don't care what Morrison thinks right now, she said. I care what's true. Is the land yours? Yes. Do you have documentation? Every piece of paper since 1861. Then we have 90 days and the truth, she said. That's enough to work with. William looked at her across the table. She had seen that look before, not in him specifically, but in people generally, the look of someone who has been carrying a weight alone for so long that having someone simply sit down across from them and say, that's enough to work with land somewhere unexpected. He looked away first. He picked up the letter. He set it down again. There's one more thing, he said. She waited. Morrison mentioned that Decker has been making inquiries, William said, about my household. About you. He said the last 2 words carefully, like a man navigating something he hadn't had time to fully map yet. He's suggesting to people in town that the situation here is irregular, that my judgment has been compromised. Eleanor was very still for a moment. He's suggesting that because you brought a woman from an agency, you're not thinking clearly. Yes. She thought about Victoria Hale in the general store. She thought about Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Forsyth. She thought about the way people in small communities build narratives and how once a narrative has roots, it is very difficult to pull out. He's using me, she said, not a question. He's using everything available to him, William said. That's who he is. Eleanor nodded slowly. The thing moving through her now was not the fear she might have expected. It was something harder than fear and cleaner than anger. It was the particular clarity that comes when you understand the full shape of what you're fighting and you decide to fight it anyway. All right, she said. Then we need to change the narrative. William's eyes came back to her. What do you mean? I mean that Decker is telling a story about you, she said, about this ranch, about what's happening here. And the people of this county are going to believe one story or another. What we need to do is make sure ours is louder. She looked at him steadily. The Harvest Festival is in 6 weeks. William stared at her. Eleanor, I know it sounds like the wrong direction, she said. But listen to me. The festival is the biggest gathering in the county. Every family, every rancher, every merchant in 3 settlements comes to that festival. If this ranch is represented there, if what comes out of this kitchen is at that festival, then every single person who's been hearing Decker's version of events is going to have a different version standing right in front of them. William was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. She had learned that with him. You want to cook for the festival, he said. I want to show this county what this ranch is, she said, and what the people in it are worth. He looked at her. Then he looked at the table. Then he looked at the letter from Morrison, which said in its careful legal language that Harlan Decker had influence and time and money, and a judge who owed him something. You'd be taking on a considerable amount of work, he said. I'm aware, Eleanor said. Martha will have opinions. Martha always has opinions, Eleanor said. I'll handle Martha. Something moved across his face that was unmistakably, undeniably a smile. It was brief. It was gone almost before she could be certain she'd seen it. But it had been there. All right, he said. All right, she said. But what neither of them knew, what neither of them could have anticipated, was that the real strike was coming 3 days later, and it wouldn't come from Decker's lawyer, or from Victoria Hale, or from anyone they'd already identified as the opposition. It came from inside the ranch. The hand's name was Roy Casper. He'd been at the Carter Ranch for 4 years, which made him one of the more senior men on the property, and he had always been reliable in the way that certain men are reliable, present, competent, doing the work without complaint. Eleanor had never had a particular sense of him one way or the other. He ate what she put in front of him, nodded when she passed, and went about his business with the focused silence of a man who kept himself to himself, which was why she was surprised to find him in the main house on a Thursday afternoon when William was out riding the northern fence line with Thomas. She came through the back door with a basket of herbs she'd cut from the small kitchen garden she'd established against the south wall of the house, and Roy Casper was standing in the hallway outside the office door with his hat in his hand and an expression she didn't know how to read. "Roy," she said, "Mr. Carter's not here." "I know," Roy said. "I was looking for you." Eleanor set down her basket. "What can I do for you?" He turned his hat in his hands. He was somewhere in his mid-30s with a face that had been outdoors for most of its life, and he looked at her now with something that was uncomfortable and deliberate at the same time, like a man delivering news he'd rehearsed. "Decker's man came to the bunkhouse last night," he said. Eleanor was very still. "Which man?" "Fellow named Cole. Works as Decker's foreman but mostly does his errands." Roy's jaw tightened. "He offered me $120 to take the original deed documents out of Mr. Carter's office and bring them to Decker." The room seemed to compress slightly. "He offered you $120 to steal the deeds," Eleanor said. "Yes, ma'am." "And you came to tell me this rather than take the money," she said. Roy looked at her with an expression that held something she hadn't expected, dignity plain and unadorned. "I've worked for Mr. Carter for 4 years," he said. "He's paid me fair and treated me decent. I'm not a man who can be bought for $120. He paused. "But I thought you should know because if Cole asked me, he asked others. And not everyone on this property has my particular feeling about what's decent." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Roy," she said, "would you be willing to tell Mr. Carter everything you just told me directly tonight when he gets back?" "That's why I came," Roy said simply. She sent him back to the bunkhouse and stood in the hallway alone for a moment. Then she went to the office. The office was a room William rarely invited her into, not because he was hiding anything, but because it was the most purely his space in the house, his father's desk, his father's maps on the walls, 20 years of ranch records in a cabinet that ran the full length of one wall. She had been in here twice, both times to bring him coffee when he was working late. She tried the cabinet. It was not locked. Eleanor stood in front of it and thought very carefully about what she was going to say to William Carter when he came home. She thought about Roy Casper and the $120 and the foreman named Cole who had come to the bunkhouse. She thought about the fact that if Decker had the original deeds, Morrison's case became substantially more complicated. She thought about 90 days and a biased judge and a man who had been fighting alone for 7 years and had only recently tentatively haltingly allowed someone else to stand beside him. She went to the kitchen and started supper, and she kept her hands busy and her mind working, and she waited. William's reaction when Roy told him that evening was controlled in the particular way that very angry men control themselves when they have decided that losing control serves nobody. He listened to Roy with the level attention he gave to everything. He asked 2 questions. He thanked Roy. He told him to go to supper. Then he came into the kitchen and closed the door behind him. Eleanor turned from the stove. "You knew about this," he said. "Roy told me this afternoon," she said. "I wanted him to tell you himself, in his own words." William stood in the middle of the kitchen with his hands at his sides and his jaw set and his eyes moving over her face, like he was making sure she was real and still present, and had not somehow disappeared in the time since morning. "Cole has been on this property," he said, "into the bunkhouse, offering bribes." "Yes," she said. "Which means Decker knows his legal strategy isn't enough," he said. "He's moving to evidence tampering. He's getting desperate." "Or he's getting organized," Eleanor said carefully. Desperate and organized aren't always the same thing. A desperate man makes mistakes. An organized one doesn't need to. William looked at her. "We need to move the deeds," she said. "Tonight, somewhere off this property." William was quiet for a beat. "The deeds have been in that cabinet for 20 years. And Decker knows it," Eleanor said. Roy said no. But Roy said Cole asked others. "If even one person on this property says yes." "I know," William said. "Jim Brennan would keep them," she said. "Or the pastor, someone whose home Decker has no legal basis to search." William looked at the door. He looked at the window. He looked at his own hands for a moment, in the way she had come to recognize meant he was making a decision. "I'll ride to Brennan's tonight," he said. "Take Thomas," she said. He glanced at her. "Thomas is 19. Thomas is loyal, and he's fast, and he knows that road better than anyone else on this property," she said. "Take Thomas." He nodded once. He started for the door. "William." He stopped. She had not planned to say it. It came up from somewhere below planning. "Be careful." He turned and looked at her, and the thing she'd been catching glimpses of for weeks was fully visible. Now no longer glimpsed, but seen plain and real and lit by the lamp on the kitchen wall. "I will," he said. He and Thomas left within the hour. Eleanor sat up. She sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and the household ledger and a cup of tea that went cold, and she listened to the ranch settle into its nighttime rhythms, the far-off sound of the cattle, the creak of the house in the wind, the distant bark of a dog somewhere on the property, and she thought about everything that had led to this moment and everything that was still coming, and she did not let herself be afraid because there wasn't room for it, because fear took up space that was needed for thinking, and right now, thinking was the most important thing she had to offer. They came back after midnight. She heard the horses before she heard the door. She had the stove going and coffee ready because it was what she could do, and when William came through the back door and saw her still at the table, he stopped in the doorway for just a moment with an expression that did something complicated to the inside of her chest. "It's done," he said. "Brennan has them." "Good," she said. Thomas came in behind him, pink-cheeked from the cold and vibrating with the particular energy of a young man who has done something important and knows it. Eleanor poured him coffee and pushed the bread toward him, and he sat down and ate with the grateful concentration of the perpetually hungry. William sat across from her. He accepted the coffee. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "Decker is going to find out the deeds aren't here." "Yes," she said. "When he does, he's going to escalate." "Yes," she said again. "Eleanor." He said her name the way he had started saying it in the past few weeks. Not as a dress, not as a way of getting her attention, but as something more than that. Something that functioned almost as a sentence on its own. "This is getting dangerous. Not in a legal sense, in an actual sense." "I know," she said. "You don't have to be in this," he said. "You came here to manage a household. You didn't sign on for William." She said it the same way he said her name. She waited until he was fully looking at her. "I have spent my entire life making myself smaller, so that other people would feel more comfortable around me. I have spent my entire life stepping back and stepping aside and making sure I didn't take up too much space in rooms where I wasn't certain I was wanted." She kept her voice steady, kept her eyes on his. "I'm not doing that anymore. Not here. Not now." She paused. "This is my home." It was the first time she had called it that out loud. The word sat between them on the kitchen table, and neither of them moved for a long moment. Then William reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He didn't say anything. He just left his hand there, large and calloused and very warm, and Eleanor looked at their hands and thought about the distance between Kansas and Montana, and the letter she'd written, and the train she'd gotten on, and all the years of apologizing for existing, and she turned her hand over underneath his and held on. Thomas was looking very carefully at his bread. The Harvest Festival planning began the following Monday, and it brought its own set of battles. Eleanor had not fully anticipated the scope of what she was taking on. The festival committee was run by a woman named Cecilia Moore, whose husband was on the county land board and who had therefore a carefully maintained relationship of strategic neutrality with everyone of significance in the settlement, including Harlan Decker. Cecilia Moore was not a cruel woman. She was a careful one, and careful people were sometimes more difficult to navigate than cruel ones, because cruelty has edges you can feel and caution has none. Eleanor went to the committee meeting on a Wednesday morning. She had not been invited. She came anyway. The meeting was in the back room of the church, and there were 6 women there when Eleanor arrived, and the quality of the room's silence when she walked in told her everything about what kind of welcome she was receiving. Cecilia Moore looked up from the paper she was consulting. She was a composed woman of 50 with sharp eyes and a practiced smile. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "I wasn't aware you were joining us today." "I heard the committee was organizing the food arrangements for the festival," Eleanor said and sat down. "I'd like to contribute." The women exchanged glances. Eleanor watched them do it without reacting to it. "We have arrangements in place," said a woman named Mrs. Porter, whose voice had the slightly elevated quality of someone accustomed to organizing things. "I'm sure you do," Eleanor said. "I'm offering additional capacity, more food, more variety, and I'll cover the cost of the additional supplies myself." She paused. "I understand the festival feeds 2, sometimes 300 people. That's a significant undertaking. I'm not here to take anything over. I'm here to help." Another exchange of glances. More complicated this time. Cecilia Moore was looking at her with those sharp eyes assessing. Eleanor recognized the calculation happening behind them. The question was not whether Eleanor's cooking was good that was now sufficiently established in the county that it wasn't seriously in question. The question was whether including Eleanor was a political act, and if so, toward which political end. "The festival committee has always been a community effort," Cecilia said carefully. "And the Carter Ranch is part of this community," Eleanor said. Just as carefully, just as firmly. A woman at the end of the table, younger than the others, with red hair and an expression that suggested she had opinions she had been sitting on, made a small sound. Eleanor looked at her. The woman looked back. "I've had her stew," the woman said to the room at large. "At the Sunday dinner last month. If she wants to cook for the festival, I think we let her cook for the festival." The woman's name, Eleanor would learn, was Clara. A coincidence she absorbed with complicated feelings. Clara Reeves, whose husband worked the post route and who had apparently been waiting for someone to say the obvious thing. The room shifted. Not dramatically, but it shifted. "We'll need a list of what you propose to contribute," Cecilia Moore said. "I'll have it to you by Friday," Eleanor said. She left the meeting and stood outside the church in the February cold and let herself breathe for a moment. Then she walked to her wagon and drove back to the ranch and went straight to the kitchen and stood in front of the stove and started planning. She planned for 3 days. She planned the way she did everything with complete attention, working from what she knew about feeding large numbers of people in conditions that were not ideal, about what traveled well and what didn't, about what people wanted at the end of a long day of festival activity and what they actually needed. She thought about every detail. She thought about the Carter Ranch name that would be associated with what she produced, and she thought about what she wanted that name to mean in this county. Martha came into the kitchen on the second day and looked at the papers spread across the table. "You're serious," Martha said. "I am always serious," Eleanor said. Martha sat down. She looked at the lists. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "You can't do all this with the kitchen equipment we have. The festival pits are community maintained. You'll need the committee's sign-off to use the main cooking equipment." "I know," Eleanor said. "Cecilia Moore controls access to that equipment," Martha said. "I know that too," Eleanor said. Martha was quiet again. Then, "I could talk to her. Cecilia and I have known each other for 15 years. She respects me even when she doesn't agree with me." She paused. "If I vouch for this, she'll listen." Eleanor looked at the woman who had told her on her first morning at this ranch that the kitchen was already running fine without her. She looked at the woman who had handed her a jar of preserves that had been too painful to open and watched her use them without saying a word. She looked at Martha Bell, who had given her 20 years of loyalty and had apparently decided to extend some of it. "Martha," she said, "I would be grateful. Don't make me regret it," Martha said, but she was already standing up, already reaching for her coat. The twist arrived on a Thursday 9 days before the festival in the form of a woman Eleanor had never met. She was at the general store collecting the last of the supplies she'd ordered when Harold Price appeared from the back room with an expression she had not seen on him before. Harold Price had one of those faces that managed to convey information through arrangements of features, while the face itself remained outwardly composed, and what his face was conveying now was something has happened, and it is significant. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and the way he said it made her put down what she was holding. "There's someone asking for you, in town. She arrived on the morning stage." "Who?" Eleanor said. Harold looked at the counter. "She says her name is Frances Whitmore." Eleanor went absolutely still. "She says," Harold continued carefully, "that she's your sister." The world rearranged itself without Eleanor's permission. Frances. 7 years without a letter. 8 years since the falling out that Eleanor had rebuilt her entire life around recovering from the slow, painful private reconstruction of a woman who had been told by her own blood that she was too much and not enough simultaneously. Frances, who had married well and moved to Denver, and written once, exactly once in all those years, a letter that had said nothing and meant nothing, and had been, Eleanor eventually understood, sent not for Eleanor's sake, but for Frances's conscience. "Where is she?" Eleanor said. "Waiting at the hotel," Harold said. She asked if you were well. She seemed—" He paused, choosing his word with the care of a man who understood that some words once deployed could not be recalled. "Worried," he said. Eleanor picked up the supplies she'd set down. She paid for them. She loaded them into the wagon with the deliberate physical concentration of a person who needs their hands doing something precise so that the rest of them can manage. Then she drove to the hotel. Frances Whitmore was 41 years old and had always been the beautiful one. This was a fact that Eleanor had grown up understanding. The way you grow up understanding geography. It was simply the shape of the territory. Unchangeable, not anyone's fault. Frances had their mother's coloring, their father's height, a natural elegance that had always attracted attention the way certain flowers attract certain insects. She had been, for most of their childhood, the sister people saw first. She was sitting in the small lobby of the hotel, and she looked up when Eleanor walked in, and something moved across her face that Eleanor couldn't immediately name. "Ellie," she said, and then before Eleanor could respond, "You look different." Eleanor stood in the middle of the lobby and looked at her sister, whom she had not seen in 8 years, and thought about everything she wanted to say, and everything she wasn't ready to say, and everything she might never be ready to say. "Frances," she said, "why are you here?" Frances stood up. She was still beautiful, still elegant, still carrying herself with the ease of a woman who had never spent a single day of her life apologizing for the space she occupied. And she was also, Eleanor saw now, frightened. "I heard what's happening," Frances said. "About the land dispute, about Decker." She paused. "About you." "How?" "Alice Brennan wrote to a woman in Denver who is a friend of mine," Frances said. "She said you'd come out here and turn some lonely man's ranch into a real home, and we're now in the middle of something that could get complicated." She looked at Eleanor steadily. "I came because you're my sister." "You haven't been my sister for 8 years," Eleanor said. It came out quieter than she'd intended. Not angry, just true. Frances flinched. It was a small flinch, the kind a person makes when they've been expecting something, and it still hurts when it arrives. "I know," Frances said. "I know that, and I'm not here to pretend I've been what I should have been." She sat back down, which was not a gesture of defeat, but of patience. The patience of someone who has decided they will wait out whatever they need to wait out. "I'm here because I have something that might help you. That might help the man you're living with." Eleanor looked at her. "What are you talking about?" Frances opened the bag she'd been carrying and took out a folded paper. She held it out. Eleanor crossed the lobby and took it and opened it. It was a letter, dated 1879, written by a man named Carl Decker. Harlan Decker's father to a land agent in Billings. And in it, Carl Decker described with the particular frankness of a man writing a private letter. He expected no one else to ever read the surveying error he had arranged. The boundary markers he had paid a surveyor named Grant Hobbs to place incorrectly. He described the value of the water access the error would eventually make available. He described in plain language the fraud he was committing. Eleanor read it twice. Her hands were very steady. "Where did you get this?" she said. "Grant Hobbs had a son," Frances said. "The son moved to Denver. He and my husband had business together. When my husband heard what Harlan Decker was doing with his father's manufactured survey, he found a way to acquire the letter." Frances paused. "He drove me to the stage himself. He said to tell you that some wrongs take a long time to find their correction, but they find it eventually." Eleanor looked at the letter in her hands. She thought about 90 days and a biased judge and a legal strategy built entirely on a manufactured surveying error from 15 years ago. She thought about the fraud at the root of all of it documented in the handwriting of the man who had perpetrated it. She folded the letter. She looked at her sister. "You should come to the ranch," she said. "There's enough room, and I need to show this to William tonight." Frances stood. There was something in her face that was not quite relief and not quite hope, but occupied the complicated territory between them. "Ellie," she said, "I'm sorry. For all of it. For what I said. For all the years I know," Eleanor said. Not forgiving it yet. Not refusing it either. Just receiving it because it was real, and because there was not time right now for the full weight of 8 years. But there would be time, and she was beginning to understand that some things didn't need to be resolved immediately to be worth returning to. "Come on," she said. "The wagon's outside." Frances followed her out into the Montana cold, and Eleanor drove them back to the ranch with the letter folded inside her coat against her chest, next to the steady beating of a heart that had survived more than most people knew, and had come here to this specific place in this specific winter to finally stop surviving and start something else entirely. William read the letter standing up. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he set it on the table very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid of damaging. "This is the original," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "This is Carl Decker's handwriting admitting to arranging the fraudulent survey," he said. "Yes." He looked up at her. Then he looked at Frances, who was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea Martha had silently provided, because Martha's response to extraordinary situations was always reliably to produce something warm to drink. "Your sister brought this from Denver," William said. "Her husband helped obtain it," Eleanor said, "from the son of the surveyor Decker paid." William was quiet for a very long moment. Eleanor watched him process it. Not just the legal significance of it, though, that was enormous, but the other thing, the thing underneath. The understanding that this fight, which he had been prepared to wage with everything he had for as long as it took, might actually be winnable. That the truth, which he had always known was on his side, but had sometimes doubted was enough on its own, had been documented all along, sitting in someone's possession in Denver, waiting. "I need to write to Morrison tonight," he said. "I'll get the paper," Eleanor said. "And I need—" He stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the letter. He looked at his hands for a moment, and then back at her. And what was in his face was something she had never seen there before. Something past the guarded, and past the careful, and past all 7 years of managed distance. "Thank you," he said. It was the simplest thing he'd said to her since she arrived, and it meant more than any of it. "Don't thank me," she said. "Thank Frances." "I'll thank you both," he said. He sat down, and she put paper in front of him, and he started to write, and the kitchen was full of people. Martha moving quietly, Frances with her tea, Thomas appearing at the back door and being waved to a seat by Martha before he could ask any questions. And outside, the Montana night was doing what it always did. Indifferent and vast, and inside the Carter ranch the lamp was burning, and William Carter was writing a letter that was going to change everything. And Eleanor Whitmore stood at the kitchen counter and let herself feel for just one moment the full weight of what this was. Then she went back to work, because that was what she did. That was who she was. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt not like a limitation, but like a gift. Morrison's reply came 6 days after William sent the letter, with Carl Decker's confession enclosed, and it arrived not by post, but by Ryder, a young man who had clearly been told to move fast and had taken the instructions seriously, because he covered the 4-day route in 3 and arrived at the Carter Ranch at 6 in the morning, with his horse breathing hard and a sealed envelope in his coat. William read it at the kitchen table while Eleanor poured the Ryder coffee, and Martha appeared from nowhere, the way Martha always appeared when something significant was happening, and stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her face doing its careful work of not revealing anything prematurely. He read it once. He set it down. He picked it up and read it again. Then he looked at Eleanor and said, "Morrison says this changes everything." Eleanor sat down across from him. "How much is everything?" "He says the letter from Carl Decker constitutes direct evidence of fraud in the original survey filing," William said. "He says with this document, he can not only defeat Decker's claim on the north section, he can have the entire manufactured dispute thrown out and potentially pursue a fraud case against Harlan Decker through the territorial court." He paused. "He also says he's filed a motion challenging Judge Aldrich's assignment to the case on grounds of conflict of interest, and that 2 of the county commissioners have already indicated they'll support the challenge." "Jim Brennan," Eleanor said. "Jim Brennan," William confirmed. "And apparently, Harold Price wrote something for the settlement paper that has been read somewhat widely." Martha made a sound from the doorway. It was the sound she made when she was satisfied about something and trying to maintain the appearance of neutrality. The writer finished his coffee, accepted the bread Eleanor pushed toward him, and left within the hour. The morning after he rode out, Eleanor went back to the festival preparations, because the festival was in 4 days, and there was still an enormous amount of work to do, and winning a legal battle, while significant, did not cook 300 portions of food. Frances had been at the ranch for a week by then, and she had to Eleanor's cautious surprise been useful. This was not the Frances she remembered. The Frances she remembered had opinions about how things should be done and preferred that someone else do them. This, Frances rolled up her sleeves. She had appeared in the kitchen on her second morning and asked Martha with genuine deference what needed doing, and Martha, who had formed an opinion of Frances Whitmore within approximately 90 seconds of meeting her and had not made it particularly easy to change that opinion, had pointed her at the dried beans that needed sorting, which was the kind of task Martha assigned to people she wasn't sure about yet, because it required patience and attention, and produced something useful, and told you a great deal about a person. Frances sorted beans for 2 hours without complaint. After that, Martha's opinion shifted. "Your sister has more in her than shows at first," Martha told Eleanor on the 3rd day in the particular tone of someone reporting a finding they hadn't expected. "Most people do," Eleanor said. What she didn't say was that having Frances here was doing something to her that she hadn't anticipated and wasn't entirely sure how to manage. 8 years was a long time. The wound was real. The history was real. And Frances, to her credit, did not press. She did not make speeches, or ask for absolution, or try to rewrite what had happened. She simply showed up in the mornings and worked, and was present in the evenings, and occasionally carefully said something that reminded Eleanor of who they had been to each other before everything went wrong. On the 5th night they were washing dishes together after supper. William had gone to his office. Thomas had gone to the bunkhouse. Martha had gone home. And Frances said without looking up from the pot she was scrubbing, "You're happy here." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "It shows," Frances said. "You carry yourself differently. You're not—" She stopped. "Not apologizing," Eleanor said. Frances looked at her then. And what was in her face, was something complicated and honest, and not particularly comfortable, because it was the face of a woman who understood that she had contributed to the years of apology and was living with that understanding. "No," she said, not apologizing. They washed the rest of the dishes in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the silences they'd been living in all week. Less careful, more real. The morning of the harvest festival arrived with cold, clear air and a sky that went on forever. The particular Montana blue, that seemed to have more depth than sky, had any right to have. Eleanor had been up since 3. She had barely slept the 2 nights before, it not from anxiety exactly, but from the focused energy of someone who has committed fully to a thing and cannot afford the distance that sleep creates. By the time the rest of the ranch was stirring, the wagon was loaded. Thomas had organized the loading with the concentrated enthusiasm he brought to tasks he understood to be important. He had recruited Roy Casper and another hand named Peters, and the 3 of them had moved everything from the kitchen to the wagon with the efficiency of men who had been motivated by proximity to good cooking for the past several weeks and understood on a cellular level what was at stake. Martha stood at the back of the wagon and conducted the loading, the way a general conducts a field operation, which is to say with minimal words and maximum authority. William helped Eleanor up onto the wagon seat. His hand was on her elbow, and he held it a moment longer than the assistance strictly required, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything, because the thing between them had moved past the point where it required words for every instance of it. "Ready," he said. "Yes," she said. He went to his horse, and they moved out toward the festival grounds, and Eleanor looked at the wagon loaded with everything she had made, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, which was certainty. Not the brittle certainty of someone trying to convince themselves of something. The solid, grounded certainty of a person who knows what they are doing and why. The festival grounds were already alive by the time they arrived. 3 settlements worth of people converging on the same flat stretch of land, setting up tables and booths and the communal cooking pits that the festival committee maintained. Children running. Men unhitching wagons. Women directing the arrangement of things with the particular focused energy of people who have been planning this for weeks and are now executing. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon and stood for a moment taking in the scale of it. Then she went to work. She had a designated area Cecilia Moore had, following Martha's conversation with her, been scrupulously fair about the allocation which Eleanor respected, and she set up with Thomas and Roy's help, organizing everything with the efficiency of a woman who had spent 30 years learning how to feed people in whatever space she was given. The first test came within the hour. A woman she didn't recognize, heavy-set herself with a kind face and wary eyes, came close and looked at the spread Eleanor was arranging and said, "You're the woman from the Carter Ranch." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Eleanor Whitmore." "I heard about you," the woman said, and then, as if she'd caught herself, added quickly, "My sister-in-law was at that Sunday dinner. She hasn't stopped talking about your bread." Eleanor smiled. "The bread's not here today," she said. "But there are other things. Come back in an hour." The woman came back in 40 minutes. She brought 2 other women with her. By midday, Eleanor's section had a line. She had not expected that. She had hoped for it, had planned for it in the way you plan for things you want without being certain you'll get. But seeing it happen in reality was different from planning it. Real people. Real faces. A young mother holding a child on her hip who ate half the bowl of stew herself before realizing she was doing it, and laughed. An old rancher who had the careful walk of a man with bad knees, and who took one bite of the cornbread and closed his eyes for a moment in the way of someone receiving something they didn't know they'd been missing. A group of teenagers who descended on the pie table with the focused intent of people who had spotted a strategic target. Thomas was moving through the crowd, refilling, carrying, wearing an expression of such uncomplicated pride that it made something ache pleasantly in Eleanor's chest. Martha was at the main station, dispensing portions with the authority she brought to everything, and people who tried to take more than their share learned quickly why 20 years of feeding ranch hands had made her what she was. Frances was beside Eleanor for most of the morning, doing whatever needed doing, and at one point, Eleanor looked sideways at her sister and found Frances watching her with an expression that was unguarded in a way Frances rarely allowed herself to be. "What?" Eleanor said. "I'm just watching you," Frances said. This is what you were always supposed to be doing." Eleanor didn't have time to respond to that because 3 more people had arrived at the table, but she carried the words with her through the rest of the morning. The confrontation she had been half expecting arrived at midday, and it came in the form she should have anticipated. Not dramatic, not loud, but deliberate. Harlan Decker himself came to the festival. She had not seen him before. She knew him by the way the space around him changed when he arrived. The slight shifts in posture of the men nearby. The particular quality of attention that powerful men generate in communities where power is a limited resource. He was in his 50s, broad, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had settled into something that was used to getting what it wanted. He moved through the festival grounds with 2 men behind him, greeting people with the easy familiarity of a man who had been here a long time and intended to keep being here. He came to Eleanor's section. He stood in front of it for a moment, looking at the food, looking at the line, looking at Eleanor. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was pleasant. His eyes were not. "Mr. Decker," she said. She kept her hands moving. She was refilling a serving dish, and she did not stop doing it. "Quite an operation you've set up here," he said. "Thank you," she said, as if it were a genuine compliment. "William Carter's cook," he said. And the way he put it was precise and intentional, putting her in her place the way you place a piece of furniture, functional, located, not the point. "William Carter's household," Eleanor said just as precisely. "There's a difference." Decker looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him with the same level steadiness she had brought to every confrontation since she arrived in Montana, the steadiness she had built over 36 years of being looked at like she didn't belong where she was standing. "Enjoying the festival," he said. "Very much," she said. "Are you? I imagine it's more pleasant when you're not in the middle of a fraud investigation." She said it quietly. She said it in exactly the same tone she'd used for everything else. She watched him absorb it. His expression didn't change, which told her he had practiced not letting his expression change. But something in his eyes did, and she saw it, and she filed it away. "I'm not sure what you think you know," he said. "I know what Morrison knows," she said. "I imagine you'll be hearing from him shortly if you haven't already." A beat of silence. Then Decker said in a voice that had dropped below pleasant to something that was the shape of pleasant, without the content. "You're a long way from Kansas, Miss Whitmore. It might be worth remembering that." "Montana suits me," she said pleasantly. "I expect I'll be here a good while." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he turned and walked away, and his 2 men followed him, and Eleanor went back to serving food, as if the entire exchange had not happened. Beside her, Thomas let out a breath he'd apparently been holding since Decker arrived. "Miss Whitmore," he said very quietly. "That was something." "That was nothing," she said. "Keep the line moving, Thomas." He kept the line moving. The twist came at 2 in the afternoon, and it was not from Decker. It was from Victoria Hale. Victoria arrived at Eleanor's section, not with the open challenge Eleanor had learned to expect from her, but with something that took Eleanor a moment to identify, because it was so unexpected uncertainty. She was as beautifully dressed as always, her posture impeccable, her chin at its characteristic elevation. But her eyes were different than they'd been in the general store. Something had happened to them. She stood at the edge of the section and looked at the food and the people and the line, and then she looked at Eleanor, and what was in her face was the expression of someone who has been holding a position for a long time and has recently privately begun to suspect it was the wrong one. "Miss Whitmore," she said. "Miss Hale," Eleanor said. "Would you like something?" A pause. Victoria looked at the pie, back at Eleanor. Her jaw was doing the work of a woman composing something she had not planned to say. "My father had a conversation with Mr. Carter yesterday," she said finally. Eleanor waited. "About the Decker matter," Victoria said. "About the letter." She hesitated. My father has significant standing with two of the territorial court administrators. He's offered to speak on Mr. Carter's behalf. Eleanor set down what she was holding. She looked at Victoria properly. Your father is supporting William's case, she said. Yes, Victoria said. And then because she was apparently decided on honesty today, cost it what it would. My father is a businessman. He understands what it means if Decker succeeds in this. If manufactured surveys and purchased judges can be used against William Carter, they can be used against anyone. She paused. Including my father. That's practical, Eleanor said carefully. Yes. Victoria agreed. It is. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at Eleanor. It's not all it is, she said. But it's part of it. Eleanor looked at this woman who had told her in a general store 2 months ago not to mistake William Carter's kindness for something it wasn't. She thought about what it cost a proud woman to stand in front of someone she'd tried to diminish and say something approaching honest. Thank you, Eleanor said, for telling me, and please, thank your father. Victoria nodded. She looked at the pie one more time. Then, Agnes Culbertson said your blackberry pie is extraordinary. Would you like a piece? Eleanor asked. A beet. Then Victoria Hale did something Eleanor had never seen her do before. She smiled, not the practiced social smile, something more real and more surprised as if it had arrived without being planned. Yes, she said. I believe I would. Eleanor cut her a piece and handed it across the table, and Victoria took it, and that was the moment unremarked by anyone else unannounced. Quiet as weather changing. That was the moment Eleanor understood something she hadn't let herself fully believe yet. She had changed this place, not by being beautiful, not by being fashionable, not by being what anyone had expected, by showing up and working and refusing to apologize and feeding people and standing her ground and caring consistently about the people in front of her. She had changed it. William found her at 3 o'clock when the crowd was beginning to thin, and Eleanor was in the process of organizing the serving containers for the return trip. He came through the remaining crowd with the ease of a man who knows where he is going, and when he reached her, he stood beside her rather than across from her shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the festival grounds. Douglas Hale spoke to Carruthers this morning, he said. Carruthers was one of the territorial court administrators. Morrison got the call 2 hours ago. The conflict of interest motion on Aldrich succeeded. The case is being reassigned. Eleanor kept her hands moving. That's good news. That's excellent news, William said. Combined with the letter Morrison says the fraud case is as strong as anything he's argued in 10 years. He paused. He thinks Decker knows it. He thinks we'll get an offer to settle before this ever sees a courtroom. Don't settle, Eleanor said immediately. He looked at her. Don't let him buy his way out of it, she said. What he did, what his father did, it has to be on the record. Other people need to know it can be fought. William was quiet for a moment. Morrison will want to discuss terms. I know, she said. I'm not a lawyer, and you'll do what's right for the ranch, but I'm telling you what I think. I know you are, he said. And then, I usually do what you think. She looked at him sideways. He was looking straight ahead, but there was something in his jaw that was the shape of the almost smile she had catalogued over months. That's either very wise or very concerning, she said. Probably both, he said. They stood beside each other for a moment, in the familiar, companionable silence that had grown between them over months, the silence of two people who have stopped performing ease around each other and simply have it. Then William said, I need to tell you something. Something in his voice made her turn. He was looking at her directly now with the expression she had learned the name of over these months, the one that lived past the guarded and past the careful, and was simply plainly himself. I spent 7 years in that house, he said. After Clara, I told myself I was managing. I told myself I was fine. I built the operation, I ran the numbers, I did the work. He stopped. I wasn't fine. I was disappearing, a little bit every year. And I didn't... He stopped again, working through something. I didn't know that was what was happening until you came. Eleanor was very still. "You made the house smell like something again," he said. "You sat at my table and listened to me talk about cattle operations like it mattered, and it did matter because you made it matter. You wrote letters and organized dinners and stood in front of Decker this morning like he wasn't any kind of threat, which he isn't because of you." He looked at her, and his voice was very level and very certain in the way he was certain about things that were true. "I am not going to stand here at a harvest festival and make a speech," he said. "But I want you to know. I want you to know what the past months have been. I want you to know what you are to this ranch. To me." Eleanor looked at him. She thought about Kansas. She thought about the letter. She thought about the train and the cold platform and the suitcase he had picked up without being asked, and the bread she had baked on the 7th morning because she needed to begin somewhere. "William," she said, "I know." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached over and took her hand the way he had at the kitchen table months ago, quietly and without ceremony, and held it. Across the festival grounds, Thomas spotted this and turned immediately to Roy Casper and said something. Roy looked over and made a sound of satisfaction and went back to loading the wagon. Martha, who had eyes in places that were physiologically improbable, observed it from 40 feet away and produced an expression that was as close to beaming as Martha Bell was constitutionally capable of producing. Frances saw it from where she was standing and turned away to give them the privacy of not being watched, and in turning away, she found herself looking at the county that her sister had come to, and changed simply by being fully unapologetically herself. And something in Frances Whitmore resolved itself quietly that afternoon, some long-standing argument she had been having with herself about the shape of her own life and what it was still possible to do with it. The ride back to the ranch was full in a way rides usually aren't. Thomas talked about everything that had happened with the focused energy of someone who needs to process a significant experience by narrating it in considerable detail. Roy drove the wagon with quiet satisfaction. Martha sat in the back and said very little, which was her version of contentment. Frances rode beside Eleanor and was simply present, which was Eleanor was learning sometimes all that was required. William rode alongside the wagon for most of the journey, and several times Eleanor looked over at him and found him already looking at her, and neither of them said anything on those occasions because nothing needed to be said. It was late afternoon by the time the ranch came into view, and the light was doing the particular thing it did in Montana at that hour, long and golden and impossibly clear, the kind of light that made everything it touched look like itself, but better. They came through the gate, and the hands who'd stayed behind came out to help unload, and the property filled with the good noise of work being completed, and a day being put to rest, and Eleanor stood in the middle of it for a moment and felt the particular weight of a good day. Martha appeared at her elbow. "Stew's still on the back stove," she said. "I kept it going." "You planned for this," Eleanor said. "I plan for everything," Martha said, then quietly, without looking at Eleanor, "It was a good day, what you did out there." She paused. Clara would have liked it. She walked away before Eleanor could say anything, which was very like Martha. And Eleanor stood in the yard, with the evening coming on, and the ranch moving around her, and held those words carefully, the way you hold something that deserves to be held carefully. Inside the house, she found William in the kitchen. He had his coat off and was at the counter with a cup of coffee, and he looked up when she came in. "Everyone's settled," he said. "Good," she said. She went to the stove and checked the stew and stirred it, and got a bowl for herself and one for him without asking, because she had long since stopped asking about things she already knew. They sat down across from each other and ate. After a while, William said, "Morrison is coming to the ranch next week to go over the case in person." "I'll make sure there's enough food," Eleanor said. He looked at her across the table. "There's always enough food," he said. "There is now," she agreed. He looked at her for another moment. Then he reached into his coat, which was hanging on the chair beside him, and took out a small box. He set it on the table between them. Eleanor looked at it. She looked at him. "I've been carrying that for 3 weeks," he said, waiting for a moment that felt right. He paused. "I'm not sure there's ever going to be a moment that feels completely right, so I'm doing it now." Eleanor looked at the box, then at him. "This isn't how I imagined it would go," William said. Whatever I imagined when I wrote to the agency. I thought I needed someone capable, someone practical, someone who could run the household." He paused. "I did not think I needed someone who would make me remember what it felt like to want to come home." Eleanor opened the box. The ring was simple. Gold with a small stone. Not flashy. Not the kind of thing designed to perform wealth. The kind of thing chosen by a man who understood that permanence and simplicity are not opposites. "Eleanor Whitmore," William said, "I would like you to stay." She looked at him. "I'm already here," she said. "I know," he said. "I want you to be here in the other way." She looked at the ring. She looked at his face. She thought about the woman who had written a letter beginning with "I am not a beautiful woman" and had boarded a train into the unknown, and she thought about who that woman was now after these months in this house, in this life she had built with her own hands. "Yes," she said, simply and completely. "Yes." He took the ring from the box and put it on her hand, and she looked at it, sitting there on her finger, and thought that she would need a little time to get used to seeing it, but not very much time. It already looked like it belonged. Outside, the Montana evening was settling in around the Carter Ranch, the sky going from gold to deep blue, the cattle quiet in the far pastures, the hands in the bunkhouse, the house lit from within by lamp and stove, and the warmth of people who had decided to make something together. And inside, at the kitchen table, William Carter poured more coffee, and Eleanor Whitmore held her hand up and looked at the ring in the lamplight and felt for the first time in 36 years not the cautious, careful feeling of a woman trying not to take up too much space, but the solid, grounded, unhurried feeling of a woman who had finally come home. Morrison arrived on a Wednesday with mud on his boots and 3 folders of legal documents under his arm, and the expression of a man who had been working very hard and was not displeased with the results. He was younger than Eleanor had imagined, mid-40s, lean, with quick eyes, that moved over a room the way a surveyor moves over land, cataloging everything without appearing to. He shook William's hand at the door and then looked at Eleanor and said, "You must be the woman who found the letter." And Eleanor said, "My sister's husband found it." And Morrison said, "Your sister's husband didn't know what it meant. You did." And Eleanor decided she liked him. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where William had read the letter from Carl Decker, where Eleanor had sat up waiting the night he and Thomas rode to the Brennan farm, where they had eaten 100 suppers in the month since she'd arrived, and Morrison opened his folders and laid out the case. The way a careful man lays out a hand of cards he's confident about, but isn't going to celebrate until the game is over. "Decker's legal team contacted me yesterday," he said. William's eyes sharpened. "And?" "They want to settle," Morrison said. "Withdraw the claim, pay costs, seal the record." "No," Eleanor said. Both men looked at her. She kept her eyes on Morrison. "I'm sorry," Morrison said, not unkindly. Miss Whitmore." "She's right," William said. "No settlement." Morrison looked at him, then back at Eleanor, then back at his folders. "The settlement offer is substantial," he said. "It would cover the North Pasture notes with money to spare." "I understand that," William said. "I want it on the record. I want a court to document what Carl Decker did and what his son tried to do with it. I want every rancher in this territory to be able to point to a court record the next time someone comes at them with a manufactured survey." Morrison looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "That's going to take another 6 to 8 weeks." "Then it takes 6 to 8 weeks," William said. "The notes. Jim Brennan is covering the notes," William said. He insisted, "I'll pay him back when this is resolved." Morrison looked at the table. He looked at his folders. He looked at the ring on Eleanor's hand, which he had noticed the moment he sat down and had been considering what it meant for the dynamics of this conversation. He made a decision. "All right," he said. "Then we go to court." He paused. "I should tell you Decker's team is going to make this difficult. They're going to question everything. The provenance of the letter, your household arrangements, your operational finances. They're going to try to paint a picture of a man who made poor decisions because he was distracted." He looked at Eleanor directly. "They'll likely try to use your presence here as part of that narrative." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Let them try," she said. Morrison almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He stayed for 3 days. Eleanor fed him at every meal, and at every meal she observed the way William moved through the case with Morrison, the way he had internalized everything, the way he engaged with the legal arguments, not as a man out of his depth, but as a man defending something he understood completely and would not be moved from. She had known he was capable. She had known he was strong. Watching him be both of those things in a domain that wasn't physical labor or land management was something different, and she sat with it quietly and was proud of him in a way that felt domestic and enormous at the same time. On the last morning before Morrison rode back to Helena, he found Eleanor in the kitchen alone. "May I speak plainly?" he said. "I'd be disappointed if you didn't," she said. He sat down. He put his hands on the table. "I've been a lawyer in this territory for 16 years, he said. "I've watched a lot of men lose things they should have kept, and I've watched a smaller number of men keep things they should have lost. And the difference between the two groups isn't usually money or connections or even evidence, though all of those matter." He paused. "The difference is usually whether a man is fighting for something real." He looked at her. "William Carter is fighting for something real. I think you know that you're a considerable part of why that's true right now." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "He was already fighting before I got here," she said. "I just gave him better reasons." Morrison picked up his coffee. "That's a good way to put it," he said. He left after breakfast. The ranch settled back into its rhythms, and Eleanor went back to her work, and William went back to his, and the days moved forward, the way days do, not dramatically, not in a straight line, but accumulating into something building, the way a house builds one thing solid on top of another. 3 weeks later, the thing Eleanor hadn't been anticipating happened. She was in the main house kitchen on a Tuesday morning when she heard a horse come in fast, too fast for a working morning arrival. The particular speed of someone bringing news, and Thomas's voice outside. And then the back door opened, and William came in and looked at her and said, "Decker withdrew." She set down what she was holding. "Withdrew from what?" "Everything," William said. "Morrison just sent word. Decker withdrew the claim, withdrew the survey challenge, withdrew the court filing. Completely." He paused. He also had his lawyer file a document acknowledging that the North Section has been legitimately Carter land since 1861, and that the survey of 1871 was conducted in error. Eleanor stared at him. "He put it in writing." "He put it in writing," William confirmed. "Morrison says one of the territorial court administrators delivered a private communication to Decker's lawyer on Monday. Morrison doesn't know exactly what was said. He suspects Douglas Hale may have been more direct in his intervention than any of us anticipated." Something turned over in Eleanor's chest. She thought about Victoria Hale at the festival eating blackberry pie and smiling a real smile. She thought about Victoria saying it's not all it is, but it's part of it. "He didn't want a court record," Eleanor said slowly. "His father's letter read into a territorial court record. It would have followed the Decker name for a generation." "That's Morrison's assessment," William said. "So he chose the lesser damage," she said. "He chose to get out while he still could," William said. They looked at each other across the kitchen. The thing between them was large and quiet and didn't need any performance. Then Thomas appeared in the doorway with Roy Casper directly behind him, and the expressions of two men who had heard something significant from outside and needed confirmation. "It's over," Thomas said. "It's over," William said. Thomas made a sound that was part exhale and part something less composable, and Roy Casper reached out and hit Thomas on the shoulder with the flat of his hand, in the way that men communicate things they don't have words for. And Martha appeared from the back hall. She always appeared. The woman had the instincts of someone who had learned decades ago that the significant moments of a household tend to happen in its kitchen, and stood in the doorway and looked at William and said, "Well then." "Well then," William agreed. Martha nodded once. She went to the stove. She put on coffee. This was her way of marking occasions. Frances was in town that morning, having taken to making the supply run twice a week with a comfort and efficiency that would have seemed impossible for the Frances of 8 years ago, and Eleanor sent Thomas to find her with the news. She thought about what it would mean to Frances, who had driven 2 days to a stage station, with a letter she could have kept or given to someone else, or left in a drawer, who had come to Montana, not knowing what kind of welcome she'd find, who had sorted beans and washed dishes, and shown up every morning in the quiet, determined way of someone trying in the best way they knew to repair something. Frances came back from town faster than Eleanor expected, and she came through the back door and crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and took Eleanor's hands in both of hers, and she didn't say anything, and Eleanor didn't say anything, and they stood there in the middle of the kitchen, holding on for a moment, and that was enough. That was all of it. The wedding was on a Saturday in April. It was not a large wedding. Eleanor had not wanted a large wedding, and William had deferred to her in the way he had taken to deferring to her on matters of the house and the social world, because he had recognized early with the practical intelligence that made him good at everything. He turned his attention to that she understood those territories better than he did, and that there was no point in pretending otherwise. Pastor Whitfield performed the ceremony. Ruth Whitfield stood beside Frances, who was Eleanor's only attendant. Jim Brennan and Harold Price were there. Agnes Culbertson. The Brennan children in their good clothes, the youngest one falling asleep against Jim's shoulder before the vows were finished. Roy Casper and Thomas in the back, Thomas wearing an expression of such wholehearted happiness that several people near him caught it involuntarily and found themselves smiling without fully knowing why. Martha was in the front row in a dress Eleanor had never seen before. Dark green wool, clearly her best. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and her face doing the thing it did when she was feeling something significant and had decided that feeling it privately was sufficient. Victoria Hale came. She sat near the back and she was quiet, and she left promptly after, but she came, and Eleanor saw her, and when their eyes met briefly, Victoria gave her a nod that contained more in it than nods usually do. William stood at the front of the church and watched Eleanor walk toward him, and his face did something she had not fully prepared herself for. He looked at her, the way the letter had looked on paper, simple, direct, without qualification, without the careful management of a man protecting himself. He just looked at her, and what was in his face was everything. She reached him. She took his hand. "You ready?" Pastor Whitfield said. "Yes," William said. He was still looking at her. "Yes," Eleanor said. She meant it with every part of her that had ever been asked the question and said no, or said, "I don't know," or said maybe in the careful way of someone who has been disappointed enough times that commitment feels like standing too close to an edge. She said it for the woman who had written a letter beginning with an apology. She said it for the woman who had stood on a cold platform in February with an old suitcase and her whole life in front of her, and nothing certain except herself. She said it for every version of herself that had been told she was too much or not enough or the wrong kind. She said yes completely and meant it. The reception was at the ranch. Eleanor had made most of the food herself, which Martha had argued against, and Thomas had said was very on brand, which had made Eleanor laugh in the surprised way she had learned to laugh in the months since she arrived, the laugh of a woman who is no longer conserving her joy. The table in the main room held more food than it had held since the house was first built, which was to say it held more food than it had held in Eleanor's memory of the place, which was all the memory that mattered now. People ate and talked, and the Brennan children discovered the kitchen in the way children discover kitchens with complete and joyful commitment. And Ruth Whitfield did end up in a conversation with Martha about the proper ratio of cornmeal to flour that went on for 45 minutes and produced significant accord. Harold Price ate 3 pieces of pie and made a point of telling Eleanor so. Jim Brennan found William on the porch late in the afternoon, when the reception had moved into the quieter and more comfortable phase of its later hours, and they stood together for a while in the easy way of men who have become actual friends rather than merely useful to each other. "She's something," Jim said. "Not about anyone in particular, about everything that had happened." "Yes," William said. "She is." Frances left the following morning. Her husband had come for her, a quiet, substantial man named Edward, who shook William's hand and told Eleanor that he was glad she had found her place, and he said it simply, without the weight of the years underneath it, and Eleanor received it the same way. Frances held her at the door for a long moment. "Come in the summer," Eleanor said. "Both of you." "We'll come in the summer," Frances said. She got into the wagon with her husband, and Eleanor watched them go, and the watching was different from every other goodbye she had given in her life, because this one didn't feel like closing. It felt like a door left unlocked. The morning after the wedding, Eleanor was in the kitchen before 4 o'clock, because her body had not stopped knowing any other rising time, and she did not particularly want it to. She had bread to make. She had the week's planning to do. The North Pasture hands needed a different breakfast arrangement now that the season was turning, and they were starting earlier, and she had been thinking about how to manage that logistics-wise for 2 days. She was at the stove when William came downstairs. He stopped in the kitchen doorway the way he had stopped on that first morning months ago when he'd come down to find her already working before sunrise, and she'd told him to sit down without turning around. This morning she turned around. He looked at her in the lamplight, her hands already working the kitchen, already smelling like bread and coffee. The house already doing what the house did now, which was, breathe. "You're up early," he said. It was what he'd said then, the first thing, on the first morning. "There's work to do," she said. It was what she'd said then, too. He crossed the kitchen. He stood beside her at the counter. He didn't offer to help because he had learned correctly that she did not want help in the kitchen in the early hours, that this was her time, her thinking space, the place she was most purely herself. He stood beside her because he wanted to be where she was. She handed him a cup of coffee without looking away from what she was doing. He took it. They stood together in the kitchen of the Carter Ranch in the early morning dark, and outside, the Montana land was waking up the way it always woke up, slowly, enormously indifferent to individual lives, but generous to the people willing to live fully inside it. And the bread was rising, and the coffee was hot, and the house around them was alive in every room. Some months before, a woman had stepped off a train into a cold Montana afternoon, carrying an old suitcase and a letter she had almost not sent, and she had stood on a platform and waited to find out what her life was going to be. She knew now. It was this. It was bread before sunrise, and a man who stood beside her because he wanted to be where she was. It was Thomas at the back door with his hat in his hands, and Martha's dry, accurate observations, and Roy Casper, and the Sunday dinners, and the harvest festival, and the ring on her finger that had looked like it belonged from the first moment it was there. It was a county that had watched her and changed its mind, and a sister who had come across 2 states with the truth in her pocket, and a legal victory that had put fraud on the record where it could be seen and named and not used again. It was a home. Her home. Built not by appearing in it, but by filling it with work and warmth, and the stubborn, unrelenting refusal to be less than what she was. Eleanor Whitmore. Carter put her hands back in the dough and felt the morning come in around her, and she did not apologize for a single inch of it. She had learned finally what she should have always known, that a woman's worth was never something other people could grant or revoke. It had been hers all along, in her hands, in her work, in the way she walked into a room and refused to make herself small in the bread she made before sunrise, for people who would eat it and be fed in ways that went beyond what food alone could do. She had carried it with her from Kansas to Montana, through every year of being overlooked, and every morning of starting over, and it had never once left her. She had just finally stopped leaving it behind.